Before the financial crisis, banks loaded up on risky loans while regulators just looked the other way. And when those loans went bad, taxpayers were left holding the bag because big banks didn't have enough capital to stay afloat. Dodd-Frank included two major reforms to make sure that this never happens again. First, rules that make big banks meet higher capital standards so they are better equipped to handle losses. And second, rules that make the banks take annual stress tests to ensure that they aren't taking on too much risk. But since you've taken over, Chairman Powell, the Fed has rolled back on both of these reforms. And I just want to explore what that means for our economy. In April, the Fed proposed an amendment that lowers the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio. That's the special capital requirement for the too-big-to-fail banks. The FDIC claims this reform will allow the banks to maintain $121 billion less in capital. But the Fed disagrees with the FDIC's assessment. Why is that?
We actually think that the effect of that proposed change, which is under consideration, we're looking at the comments, would be pretty close to zero as it relates to the firm itself. And also we think, in other words, if you look at the entire entity, it would be less than $1 billion. I won't say zero, but I think our estimate was $400 million.
So you just think the FDIC's $121 billion estimate is made up?
They're talking about the bank, whereas we're talking about the whole firm. Within the whole firm, at the firm level.
It's the banks we have to worry about and the banks that get bailed out here.
Yeah, and the enhanced supplemental leverage ratio, the problem with this is that we don't want a leverage ratio to be the binding capital requirement because it actually calls upon, if you're bound by that, you're actually called upon to take more risk. Well, so we'd rather not have the bank bound by that.
So let's take a look. Let's take a look at this in terms of trying to strengthen the banks so that we don't have to be in a position to bail them out. The second thing you've done is you've put a lot of stock in the stress tests. And last week you called the stress tests the most successful post-crisis innovation for bank regulation. But under your leadership, the Fed has weakened the stress test regime. Here's one example. Results of this year's exercise recently became public, and reportedly 3 banks, Goldman Sachs, State Street, and Morgan Stanley, had capital levels that were too low to pass the test. I wrote to you about these banks a few weeks ago, and I appreciate your response on this. But just to be clear, after they flunked, did you give those too-big-to-fail banks a failing grade?
We gave them what we call a conditional non-object, which is something we've done.
Okay, but that's not a failing grade, right? They did not flunk.
They suffered the same penalty, which was to have to limit their distributions to the prior years.
That's what I want to ask. If you didn't flunk them, did you at least follow the Fed guidelines and make those banks submit new capital plans that would pass the test?
No. In fact, when we do the conditional non-object, we don't require them to resubmit.
So you don't require them to actually meet the criteria?
We haven't. In the many times we've used that tool over the years, we've not required that.
In other words, the Fed looked the other way. You let these banks off with what you call a conditional non-objection, letting them distribute capital to their shareholders instead of keeping it on their books. In fact, because of your action, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs investors took home about $5 billion more than they otherwise would have. That's a nice gift to the bank, Mr. Chairman. On top of that, the Fed also proposed a rule in April that would make the stress tests less severe, effectively reducing capital requirements at the 8 largest banks by a total of about $54 billion, according to a Goldman Sachs analysis. So, Chairman Powell, by your own account, the economy is doing well. We all know that bank profits are gigantic. The banks just got huge tax breaks. 3 Fed presidents, President Rosengren, President Mester, and President Evans, have suggested it is an ideal time to raise capital requirements to strengthen the banks instead of siphoning off cash to shareholders. So why is the Fed, under your leadership, persistently seeking to reduce capital requirements and weaken stress tests?
With respect, Senator, we're not doing either of those things. In fact, the stress test that in 2018 was materially more stressful. The amount of the loss and the amount of required capital to pass the test was the highest by far of any test.
You know, look, I don't know what to say. The FDIC doesn't see it that way. Goldman Sachs doesn't see it that way. The data don't seem to back you up on this. The Fed's capital requirements and the stress test are like a belt and suspenders. You can loosen the belt and rely on the suspenders, or you can take off the suspenders and rely on the belt. But if you do both, your pants will fall down. And Chairman Powell, we learned in 2008 that when the big banks' pants fall down, it's the American economy, American taxpayers, American workers who get stuck pulling them back up. So it looks like to me the Fed is headed in the wrong direction here.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.